We all make mistakes, both in our work or education and our personal lives. Sometimes they can cost us our ego, pride, and maybe a few bucks. But other times, they can cause wide-scale devastation and a whole ton of money. Not the best way to start the working week. From a $1 million grammatical error to a swaying bridge, here are 15 of the most expensive mistakes in all history. Number 15. Shanghai building collapses. When a building unexpectedly collapses, engineers break out in a sweat. Did they do something wrong? Did they make some grave errors in their design? In the case of a high-rise building that collapsed in the Minhang district of Shanghai, engineers of the actual structure can breathe a sigh of relief. After the apartment buildings collapsed, killing one worker, rumors were swirling about whether the owners had cut costs and, as a result, impacted the building's structural integrity. When people saw the pre-stressed, high-strength concrete foundation piles sitting prominently after the collapse, they presumed their hollow core undoubtedly played a part. But it's really those working on the underground car park who should be breaking out in a sweat. After investigations, it was found that a pile of mud on the building's north side, which was about 10 meters or 32.8 feet tall, alongside a 4.6 meter or 15-foot underground car park, caused the foundations to shift. These shifting foundations resulted in the building's collapse. Experts looking into the collapse said that the ground would not have withstood more than 5 meters of mud, but it had to handle twice that much. Given that compensation may have needed to be given to the 500 homeowners affected and the worker who lost his life, it was certainly shaping up to be an expensive mistake. Before we go on, like this video, smash the subscribe button and click the notification bell right now, or this centipede will crawl on your face when you're sleeping. Now it's time for the star topic. During the 1995 Kobe earthquake in Japan that killed more than 6,000 people, an entire bridge was torn apart. It looks like it just toppled right over under the sheer force of the 7.2 earthquake. But it wasn't just the viciousness of the quake that caused it to topple as it did, it was incorrectly built, which makes it one of the most expensive engineering mistakes in all history. How much do you think it cost to rebuild the city after that earthquake? Comment down below with the hashtag StarTopic and let us know your opinion in relation to what we just showed on screen. With that said, let's keep things moving. Number 14. Apple steak sold for $800. Imagine waking up in the morning to see that Apple has hit a historic $1 trillion market cap, only to remember that you sold your 10% stake for $800. That is the sorrowful reality for Ronald Wayne, who was the lesser-known third co-founder of the innovative company. Because Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs were just 21 and 25 during Apple's early days, Ronald joined to oversee mechanical engineering and documentation while, in his words, providing adult supervision. In exchange for his efforts, he was given a 10% stake in the company.
My passion wasn't computers in the first place, it was slot machines.
He even drew the first logo for the company, which was later replaced. However, Ronald had significant concerns. He worried whether business debts would fall on him. Steve Jobs had already taken out a $15,000 loan to buy supplies for the first contract. The customer was known for not paying bills, so it was a big concern. As Jobs and Wozniak were broke, but Ronald Wayne had a house and assets, he thought the bank might come knocking on his door. He wanted out. After 12 days, he took his name off the contract and sold his shares to Wozniak and Jobs. If he retained that 10% share, he would be worth more than $95 billion. Oops. Number 13. Millennium Bridge. The day that the Millennium Bridge in London's financial district opened was a monumental one. It would be the day that people could now walk from Bankside, south of the river, to the financial district, along a 320-meter lateral suspension bridge without the worry of traffic. But as the bridge was officially opened and the crowds made their way across, something no one expected happened. It started to sway. The swaying was slight at first, but before long, people were having a hard time making their way across with ease. So as quickly as the $32 million bridge opened, it was shut. As it turns out, engineers had accounted for every possible non-human element and had nailed the weight and wind requirements. But they hadn't thought about the way people walk and how these movements could change the way a footbridge should be built. Failure to account for human behavior added an extra $8.9 million to the price tag. Engineers had to fit 91 dampers, which would absorb vertical and lateral oscillations created by pedestrians walking in unison. If one good thing came out of this expensive mistake, they would call upon this information to build new bridges like it in the future. Number 12. Russia discounted Alaska. It's hard for us to imagine that Russia once owned Alaska, but it's true. It has been populated longer than any other America's location, but it was pretty much an unknown land until Russian explorer Vitus Bering claimed it for the Tsar in 1741. But it immediately became a burden. There were never many Russians living there and no permanent settlements until around 1784. It also wasn't self-sufficient since it depended on the British and Americans and native tribes for supplies. Russia worried that the US settlers would eventually overrun Alaska since they had done the same in Texas. After accumulating a lot of debt in the Crimean War and the fur trade in decline, the Tsar's brother said Alaska was unaffordable. So they negotiated a price of $7.2 million in gold for the United States to buy it. In 1867, on October 18th, the Russian flags were taken down around Alaska and US flags were put in their place. What was once called a burden that was not worth taking as a gift, let alone paying for, is now one of our country's richest states. It has a GDP of over $50 billion each year and has a labor force in oil and natural gas and seafood of over 370,000. Number 11. The $1 million comma. When you make a grammatical error in your work, you might not think it's that big of a deal, and it might not be for your situation. But if you're in the job of writing contracts, it may pay to brush up on your English. Otherwise, it may cost your company around $1 million. The telephone company in Atlantic Canada, Bell Alliant, and Rogers Communications of Toronto were embroiled in a dispute over canceling a contract involving the use of telephone poles. Out of every word in a 14-page contract, it was a comma that would see the whole thing come undone. Rogers Communications said the contract runs for 5 years and automatically renews unless a telephone company cancels it with a year's notice. But a comma in that contract meant Bell Alliant was able to end the agreement at any time with notice. The troublesome statement was, "This agreement shall be effective from the date it is made and shall continue in force for a period of 5 years from the date it is made, comma, and thereafter for successive 5-year terms, comma, unless and until terminated by 1 year prior notice in writing by either party." The comma after "for successive 5-year terms" made it look like the 1-year notice applied to the 5-year term and its renewal. So the regulator ruled in favor of the phone company, allowing them to escape their contract after just 1 year. Number 10. $9 billion blunder. Imagine being known as the guy who lost the most ever as a single trader in the history of Wall Street. Howie Hubler has that unfortunate title. At the end of 2004, he had a feeling that there was something fishy with the subprime mortgage business. He decided to bet against both it and the US real estate market using credit default swaps. Of course, we know he was right, but he predicted it too early. As we know, 4 years too early.
To take what is an extraordinary investment bank and trading business.
Howie tried to cover his losses with more CDOs, but ended up digging an even bigger hole. When the US housing market finally did collapse, Howie had lost Morgan Stanley as much as $9 billion, which ended up being the second largest trading loss in the history of Wall Street. Oops. As you would expect, Howie was out of a job. He was given the option of resigning or being fired by late 2007. When he departed, he was paid a back pay of $10 million and went on to start the Loan Value Group that works with mortgage lenders. Number 9. $60.9 billion oil spill. BP was in a world of hurt, and they've shelled out billions of dollars to fix their mistakes. In 2010, their oil drilling rig, Deepwater Horizon, exploded and sank in the Macondo prospect in the Gulf of Mexico. This explosion resulted in the largest oil spill in marine oil drilling history and the death of 11 workers.
An official report exposed systemic safety problem.
The rig experienced a variety of problems like sudden gas releases, drilling mud falling into the undersea oil formation, a pipe falling into the well, and blowout preventer leaking fluid, at least 3 times. Even years later, they were still paying out claims. In 2018, their total costs were around $65 billion. For that quarter, the costs were about 7 times higher than they anticipated. Those latest claims included about 400,000 cases, and there were still hundreds of outstanding claims that hadn't been closed. By the end of September of that year, they spent $63.4 billion on cleanup costs and legal fees. Given that the final claims were taking quite a long time due to their size and complexity, the costs were expected to balloon. BP was definitely not having a good time. Number 8. New Jersey funding error. The New Jersey funding error was described as a stunning $400 million mistake, and, well, they aren't wrong. Failure to proofread resulted in New Jersey missing out on a massive amount of federal education reform money in the Race to the Top funding scheme. They were supposed to supply budget information for the 2008 and 2009 school years on the application form. Instead, New Jersey provided the information for the current year, which was 2010 to 2011. That boo-boo meant they lost 4.8 points and shuffled them down to 11th place in the competition. Only the top 10 received funding. They received 437.8 points out of 500, and there was no appeals process to help them secure that necessary funding. Governor Chris Christie signed off the application. His spokeswoman said that an error was made, but didn't say who was responsible. The New Jersey Education Association said the loss of funding was the result of Governor Christie's misguided decision to take over the grant application process for his own political purposes. Isn't it ironic that a proofreading failure in homework caused the educational sector such a massive loss? Number 7. Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. Perhaps one of the most expensive mistakes in all of history, both in money and life, was the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster of 1986. Just 73 seconds into its flight, it broke apart, killing all 7 people on board. At 11:39 a.m. on January 28th, the Challenger fell apart over the Atlantic Ocean off Cape Canaveral's coast in Florida. It started to disintegrate when the solid rocket booster failed at liftoff. This was caused by O-ring seals in the joint that were not designed to handle this particular launch's cold conditions. As the O-ring seals failed, a breach in the SRB joint caused pressurized burning gas from within the motor to get outside and affect the adjacent joint attachment hardware and external fuel tank. What followed was utterly devastating. The right-hand SRB's alt-field joint attachment separated and the external tank failed. Then, aerodynamic forces caused it to break up. Even though the Challenger launch was televised live, very few people actually saw the disaster happen. All of the major networks cut away when it started to break apart. It wasn't until later that people were able to watch taped replays. Number 6. Sinking of the Vesa. Imagine the utter heartbreak and devastation you would feel if you threw 5% of your GNP into the creation of one of the largest warships ever made, only for it to sink almost immediately. That's pretty much what happened in Sweden with their ship, Vasa. The year was 1628, and Vasa was just leaving the Stockholm harbor docks on its maiden voyage. The Swedish Navy was weakened, and this warship meant big things for the nation. But then, just 0.8 miles into its journey, a light gust of wind caused the ship to tip over. Water then flooded through the gun portals, and it sank in the Stockholm harbor 102 feet below the ocean surface surface, resulting in a loss of 53 lives and the loss of the ship. It then lay there until 1956, when it was salvaged and put in a museum. What happened to Vasa? So many things went wrong and weren't factored into the engineering stage of this masterpiece of a ship. The boat builders were under unreasonable time pressure to finish, and there was a lack of documentation and project plans. What's more, the ship was over-engineered but lacked any scientific methods and reasoning. They had no idea how to make sure the vessel was balanced, and it ended up having quite a raised center of gravity, which contributed to its lack of balance. Number 5. Lake Piñor Sinkhole. It's hard to imagine that the 1,300-foot deep saltwater lake near New Iberia, Louisiana was once an unremarkable 11-foot deep body of freshwater. But a series of events and miscalculations changed the landscape dramatically and resulted in millions of dollars of lawsuits. In November of 1980, 12 men were probing for oil on a drilling rig under the floor of Lake Piñor. Their drill seized up at about 1,230 feet below the surface, which didn't seem right given how shallow it was. However, they heard loud popping sounds before the rig started tilting towards the water.
At that point in time, the drillers recognized that they had a fairly serious problem on their hands.
Realizing something wasn't as it should be, they cut the barges loose and exited the rig to the shores 300 yards away. Moments later, the $5 million drilling platform owned by Texaco overturned and disappeared. A whirlpool around a quarter-mile in diameter quickly formed directly over the drilling site. It was always known that the Diamond Crystal salt mine was far beneath the lake, but they had planned around it. Clearly, some calculations weren't made properly. Everyone in the mines had to evacuate as the mines filled with water and violent destruction ensued. The sucking force even caused a 12-mile-long canal to change its flow direction and for an entire body of water to change from freshwater to saltwater. Number 4. AOL $99 billion loss. While not exactly an expensive mistake, AOL Time Warner's $99 billion annual loss is definitely something worth learning more about. New accounting rules dictated that write-downs and non-cash charges were required on goodwill assets. So at the next shareholder meeting in 2003, shareholders were in for quite a shock when their fourth quarter showed a loss of $45.5 billion, followed by another $10 billion. In that quarter, $35 billion was for the AOL division write-down, while the $10 billion was a charge for the cable division. In the previous quarter, they had reported a $54 billion bill, which meant they had the largest ever recorded loss in U.S. company history. At that time, the chief executive, Richard Parsons, said it wouldn't affect their ongoing operations. In a separate, but conspiracy theorists would say related, announcement, the vice chairman, Ted Turner, resigned in May of that year. Richard said the financial results related to the accounting rules, but also the weakness of the advertising industry and the depreciating value of some of its businesses. He went on to remind his shareholders about America Online's subscriber growth being 3 times that of other internet service providers. Number 3. Cerro Grande Fire. Definitely one of the most expensive mistakes in all of history was the Cerro Grande fire in New Mexico in May 2000. It started as a controlled burn, but high winds and drought conditions quickly saw it become a disastrous forest fire. Over 400 families in Los Alamos lost their homes and 43,000 acres burned. Fortunately, no one died in the massive fire, but the U.S. General Accounting Offices believe total damages were in excess of $1 billion. The controlled burn formed part of the 10-year Bandelier National Monument Plan for fire hazard reduction. The fire started on the Cerro Grande 10,200-foot summit, which was covered in coniferous forests with ponderosa pine, white fir, Douglas fir, and aspen trees. The plan would see the burn start in the Rincon before before including flanking fires around Frijoles Creek. However, they didn't factor in winds, which frequently occur in springtime around the Jemez Mountains. These winds, combined with low humidity, increased the fire danger. There was always a chance the fire would get out of control, which it did, but there was also a risk there would already be a fire there anyway due to the tinder dry conditions. Number 2. Costa Concordia ship disaster. In 2012, a cruise liner by the name of Costa Concordia sunk after making contact with a rock while sailing close to the island of Giglio. Chaos ensued, with over 4,000 passengers and crew evacuated off the $500 million ship. While the $500 million ship was one cost, more was to come. Insurance industry payouts relating to its sinking were expected to reach in excess of $1.1 billion. Some of this amount related to the costs of removing the vessel intact. This brought about an estimated price tag of $220 million. However, given that 32 people lost their lives in the disaster, there were also personal injury, environmental, and liability costs. 4 members of the crew and a company official were sentenced to jail in Italy. Behind the scenes, many insurance companies and law firms were involved, which saw the costs rise and meant that it could play out in the courts for years. At the time, the Costa Concordia ship disaster was one of the largest maritime losses and the largest insurance loss in recent times. Number 1. B-2 stealth bomber crash. It's definitely not a financially successful day when you destroy an aircraft worth $1.4 billion. That is exactly what happened in Guam in 2008 when the Spirit of Kansas crashed on the runway at Andersen Air Force Base.
Taken off in Guam back in February, you see the pop and the ejection of the pilot, and then it crashed.
The U.S. Air Force Northrop Grumman B-2 aircraft was a stealth strategic bomber. It was the first operational loss for that aircraft type. Fortunately, both crew members were able to eject safely, but the bomber was entirely destroyed. So much so that it became the most expensive aircraft crash in history. After an investigation into the cause, it was found that heavy, lashing rain had allowed moisture to enter the air data sensors. These are used to calculate things like airspeed and altitude. 3 pressure transducers weren't functioning due to that moisture, and the flight controls inaccurately calculated the aircraft attack angle and airspeed. The bomber then ended up traveling at 12 knots slower than recorded. The crew attempted to save the bomber, but one of the wingtips hooked the ground and they were made to eject. The aircraft then hit the ground with an almighty bang before tumbling and burning after the fuel ignited. You might give someone too much change out of the till from time to time, but I bet you felt a wave of relief after hearing some of these blunders. Sometimes billions of dollars were involved. What was the most expensive mistake you ever made? Also, check out our other cool stuff showing up on the screen right now. See you next time.